Now, from this point on, Manuela, I cannot see you because of the way I'm doing the slides. So if something goes wrong, you need to make a loud noise and let me know by sound because I will not be able to see you. Okay?
Okay, I'll do it.
Okay. All right. Then, are we ready to begin, do you think?
Yes, please feel free to begin. Renato, do you have any questions or any appointments?
No, it's okay. For me, it's okay.
So, Leonor, please feel free to start your class.
Okay. Then I'm glad to welcome everyone back for this third lecture in our series of lectures on the Thomistic synthesis of philosophy and theology. In the last lecture, lecture number 2, we discussed God's eternity. In this lecture, we're going to focus on the logic of the incarnation of Christ. That's where we are. The Council of Chalcedon is the fourth ecumenical council, and it is recognized as valid by virtually all the churches, and its dogmatic pronouncements are regarded as infallible by both the Roman Catholic and the Eastern Orthodox churches. The Council of Chalcedon was responsible for issuing what we now call the Chalcedonian Formula, which is the definitive statement of the logic of the incarnation. And here it is. The Chalcedonian Formula says that Christ is one hypostasis, one person, with two natures, one fully human and the other fully divine. That formula is the heart of the Orthodox Christian doctrine of the incarnate Christ. It's theologically powerful, but it is complicated and is not easy to understand. Understanding it makes a great deal of difference to our understanding of many theological and philosophical topics, and it has been the subject of extensive philosophical and theological discussion for centuries. Now, I have to just say one thing at the beginning, which is a note of caution. There is some ambiguity in the way in which the term person is used with regard to Christ in the Chalcedonian Formula. The incarnate Christ is just one person. That is what the Chalcedonian Formula says. And on basic classical Christian metaphysics, a person is a substance. So there's just one substance in Christ. Now that substance is composite. It includes a human soul and body. It also includes the divine nature. So on the Chalcedonian Formula, when we talk about the person that is Christ, we can mean that Christ is one composite substance with two natures, a human nature and a divine nature. On the other hand, on the Chalcedonian Formula, the person of Christ, person that has the two natures, that person is the second person of the Trinity. The second person of the Trinity is God, and God is simple. So the person incarnated as Christ is the simple second person of the Trinity. When we talk about the person of Christ in this way, Christ is definitely not composite. Rather, the person of Christ understood this way is simple. So when we talk about the person Christ, the term person can refer either to the whole composite substance which Christ is as incarnate, or the term person can refer to the simple second person of the Trinity. So we have to keep in mind that there's some ambiguity there. Although there is this ambiguity in the use of the term person when it comes to Christ, it does not follow that there are two persons or two substances in Christ. The human nature, body, and soul are assumed by the second person of the Trinity and united to the second person of the Trinity in a union of person. Consequently, the new composite is the same person as before the incarnation. We also need to begin here with a very brief review of the notion of eternity, which we discussed in detail in the last lecture. And that's because the doctrine of God's eternity is presupposed in an important way in the doctrine of the Incarnation and the Chalcedonian formula. In the Christian tradition, those who accept the doctrine of God's eternity suppose that reality includes both time and eternity as two distinct modes of duration, neither of which is reducible to the other, neither of which is reducible to any third thing. God's life is characterized by eternity, just as human life is characterized by time. So there are these two different modes of duration, but they are both equally real. Now, just to remind you, this is Boethius's definition of eternity, which was the main subject of the preceding lecture. This is the classical definition of God's eternity, which was accepted by major thinkers in the Christian tradition for very many centuries. On this definition, Boethius's definition, eternity is the complete possession, all at once, of illimitable life, of life without limits. The first element in that Boethian definition is the complete possession all at once of life. This element in the definition distinguishes anything eternal from everything in time, because nothing in time possesses its life completely and all at once. It follows then that what is eternal is timeless. Nothing in time is eternal, and what is eternal cannot be in time. The second element in Boethius's definition is of illimitable life, life without limits, life without beginning, life without end. So an eternal God has his life all at once, but not as a frozen instant. God has his life all at once as a present that never began and never ends. And that is a kind of non-temporal duration, which characterizes eternity. And finally, the last bit of the review here, on the Boethian definition of eternity, there is no succession in timeless eternity. There's no past, there's no future in the life of eternal God. There's also no earlier than and no later than. Everything in eternity is present or now. And everything in eternity is simultaneous with each moment in time as that moment is temporally present. God's life consists in the duration of a present that is not limited by either future or past. So with that brief review of the doctrine of God's eternity, we can now turn to the doctrine of the Incarnation itself. On the doctrine of the Incarnation, on the Chalcedonian formula, the one person of Christ is the second person of the triune God. Consequently, everything that is true of God is also true of the person of Christ. Christ is eternal rather than temporal. His knowledge, his power, and his goodness are not limited. They are unlimited, and so on. So because the person of Christ is the second person of the Trinity, divine nature is the nature of that person. At a certain moment in time, the second person of the Trinity assumed a human nature in addition to the divine nature already his own. Although the assumption of a human nature occurred at a moment in time, the second person of the Trinity is not himself in time, rather he is eternal. Consequently, the assumption of human nature, which takes place at a time t, is not something new that occurs in the life of God in eternity. Rather, there never was a part of God's life when the second person of the Trinity had not assumed human nature. The Incarnation is thus not a change in God. There's a change in time, There's a time before the birth of Christ and there's a time after the birth of Christ. But in God's mode of duration, in God's mode of existence in eternity, every time is simultaneously present to the whole life of eternal God. So it is not the case in eternity that after this moment of time t, but not before this moment time t, God assumed human nature. There's no time in the life of eternal God. God's life is an eternal present. So this is now beginning to get us into some of the complications of the Chalcedonian formula. But if you follow the logic carefully and thoughtfully, you will see the way in which it works out consistently and also makes theological sense. As I explained at the beginning on the Chalcedonian formula, Christ is not just one person, the second person of the Trinity. He's also one composite substance with two natures. In Christ, those two natures don't mingle. They stay separate. So when Christ acts, he can act in his human nature, or he can act in his divine nature, or Christ can act in such a way as to use the elements of both natures in his action. That is, even while acting in his human nature, Christ can use powers that are beyond the merely human and that are available to him only through his divine nature. For example, acting in his capacity as a human being, Christ does miracles, but he's able to do these miracles because in his human nature, he can harness the divine power over nature. Christ can operate in either of these natures, but whichever nature he operates in, it is still Christ who operates, and Christ is just one person, not two persons. In his divine nature, God neither suffers nor dies, since neither suffering nor dying is compatible with the divine nature. So there's a sense in which it is true to say that God cannot suffer, God cannot die. But on the other hand, it is also true to say that God does suffer, God does die. God suffers and God dies in the human nature that God has assumed. In fact, on this understanding of the doctrine of the Incarnation, at least one major point of God's assuming human nature was God's making it possible for God to suffer and die. Therefore, while it's true that God cannot suffer or die in his divine nature, on the Chalcedonian formula, it is not true simpliciter that God cannot suffer or die. God, as the second person of the Trinity, can suffer and can die because he has a human nature as well as a divine nature. It's important here to see that because the second person of the Trinity is God, he has all the divine attributes. In particular, Christ is eternal and so not in time in his divine nature. And that this is so means that God is never in the state of not having an assumed human nature. For this reason, God is never unable to suffer, never unable to die. The capacity for suffering and for dying is something characteristic of God, always in human nature, whose assumption is always with God. With this much understanding of what the Chalcedonian formula asserts about the incarnate Christ, we can look now at some of the implications of the doctrine of the Incarnation as it's used in traditional theological claims. So consider the claims about Christ's suffering and death. When Christ is crucified and dies, Christ dies in his human nature. But it is Christ, the second person of the Trinity, who dies, and the second person of the Trinity is God. So God dies on the cross, but God dies in the human nature that the second person of the Trinity has assumed. God does not die in his human nature. When Christ dies, Christ's human soul separates from Christ's human body. Christ's body remains in the tomb, Christ's soul is elsewhere. but Christ himself remains united to each of these separated human parts. So in the period between Christ's death and Christ's resurrection, the second person of the Trinity is united to a human soul, and the second person of the Trinity is also united to a human body, but the human soul and the human body are not united to each other. Furthermore, because Christ has two natures, there are two different kinds of operation in Christ. In his divine nature, Christ has the operations proper to the deity. In his human nature, Christ has a complete and fully human mind. Consequently, Christ has a complete and fully human will. Since intellect and will also characterize the divine nature, however, in virtue of having two natures, Christ also has two minds. He has two intellects and two wills, one human and one divine. Different of these different intellects and these wills. It is impossible that Christ sin through either his divine or his human will, but it is possible for Christ's human will to be sinlessly out of harmony with the divine will, at least as regards desire. Consequently, the human will of Christ can and did desire what the divine will rules out. Think about Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane, praying that if it's possible, he will not die. At this point, we can think about the unity of Christ. What makes this composite one substance? What unites the divine and the human natures? The two natures of Christ are united into one thing in this one person, second person of the Trinity, which has both natures. So the unity of the incarnate Christ is a unity in person. A person is a subsisting thing, and a subsisting thing in medieval thought, in patristic thought, is generally called a supposit or a hypostasis. Since the person who is Christ is a supposit or a hypostasis, the unity of the composite Christ has been called a hypostatic union. What does this mean? The first thing to see is what this union is not. The divine person does not configure the human body and soul as a substantial form. The divine person is not a form configuring matter. The divine person is a complete thing in its own right. The substantial form of a material composite is not a complete thing in its own right. The composite Christ is not one thing because the human soul and body come to the divine person as an accident comes to an already existing thing. This mode of union is also ruled out. The human nature of Christ is not an accident of Christ, it's a component of the substance of Christ. Here's another thing the unity is not. The unity of the person and the natures in Christ is also not a union in nature, since there are two distinct natures in Christ, and they cannot be conflated or mingled into one. So the human nature of Christ is not united to the person of Christ in any of the ways in which the constituents of a substance are usually united, either by having the form of the whole configure the constituent in question, or by coming together to form a nature, or by coming to the composite as an accident of the whole. Instead, what unifies the composite Christ is just the person or the hypostasis of Christ. And that is, of course, as I said, why the union of all the parts of the composite Christ are called a hypostatic union. So now that we have a preliminary idea of what the Chalcedonian formula of the incarnate Christ is and what it implies, we can look at the main question about the doctrine. The main question about this doctrine is whether the doctrine is logically coherent. How can there be anything with two natures? there is a case to be made for the objection that the doctrine of the Incarnation attributes contradictory properties to one and the same thing. Christ is said to be limited in power and unlimited in power, for example, and these are contradictory properties, and both these contradictory properties are attributed to one and the same thing, namely Christ. And so it looks as if, on the face of it, the doctrine is just incoherent. The Christian tradition responded to this objection with what has come to be called the reduplicative strategy. A reduplicative proposition is one that restricts a property of a thing to that thing taken in a certain way. So here is a reduplicative proposition. X qua y is F. The fact that both limited and unlimited power are attributed to Christ doesn't show the Chalcedonian formula of the Incarnation incoherent, because omnipotence is predicated of Christ in his divine nature, and lack of omnipotence is predicated of Christ in his human nature. The incompatible attributes inhere in different natures of Christ, and so the response to the objection goes, and so there's no logical incoherence in attributing these incompatible properties all to the same substance, which is Christ. The response to the criticism that the doctrine of the Incarnation is incoherent because it attributes contradictory properties to the same thing, the response is therefore to rely on this reduplicative strategy. But now a question arises. How is the reduplicative strategy actually supposed to work? If Christ is omniscient in his divine nature and limited in knowledge in his human nature, why aren't we simply saying that Christ is both omniscient and non-omniscient so that he has incompatible properties? That is, why isn't the reduplicative strategy simply a complicated way of attributing contradictory properties to the same thing, so that even with the reduplicative strategy, the doctrine of the Incarnation is still logically incoherent? The answer to this objection, this refined, pursued objection, the answer lies in thinking in more detail about what it is to attribute a property to a thing. There is a distinction between a property which a whole has in its own right and a property that a whole has in virtue of having a constituent that has that property in its own right. That is, it's possible for a whole composite to borrow a property from one of its constituents. And you can understand this point if you think about a bike accident. Suppose you fall off your bicycle and you open a wound in your leg and your leg begins to bleed. And then you ask for help from somebody bicycling with you by saying to your bicycling friend, "Help, I'm bleeding." Now, what will your bicycling friend say? Will he say, "No, you are not bleeding, only your leg is bleeding"? Clearly, that would be ridiculous. You are bleeding. You are bleeding because your leg is bleeding. So the property of bleeding, which belongs first and properly to your leg, is borrowed by the whole composite which you are. And that is why it is true to say that you are bleeding, even though, strictly speaking, it's just your leg that's bleeding. So here is what the borrowing of a property is. The property of being N, of bleeding, is predicated of a thing X, U, just in virtue of the fact that X has a constituent C, that you have a constituent which is a leg, and that constituent has the property of being N in its own right. Your leg has the property of bleeding in its own right. So the property of bleeding is predicated of you just in virtue of the fact that you have a leg, and the leg has the property of bleeding in its own right. You can see the general idea of the reduplicative strategy with the help of a molecule. This molecule is the thing on the slide that is green. The molecule has a very long name. Its name is CAT enhancer binding protein. And because the name is long, it's generally abbreviated, so this molecule is just called CEP. This molecule belongs to a certain class of molecules that have a very important role in genetics. These molecules function like a zipper, so they're sometimes called zipper molecules. They can unzip the coiled DNA molecule that contains the genetic code. When the DNA molecule is unzipped by these zipper molecules, then the DNA molecule can do its job of coding for proteins. In our diagram on the slide there, the brown thing is meant to represent a DNA molecule. Now you can see that this very important molecule, CEP, green in the diagram, has a funny shape. To begin with, it has two different arms, and each arm is coiled. In fact, each arm has the same special kind of coil. The name of this special kind of coil is alpha helix. You can see that each arm of the molecule goes round and round in a particular sort of way, and that particular sort of way is an alpha helix coil. On the other hand, you can see that the two arms of the molecule aren't themselves coiled together. They're just put together in a funny way so that they have a distinct kind of Y shape to the molecule. So think about the properties of that molecule. CEP is a two-part molecule. It has two arms, and each of those arms is coiled in the manner of an alpha helix coil. So it's true to say about this molecule, the molecule has the property of being coiled in the alpha helix manner. On the other hand, this molecule CEP is a conglomerate made up of these two parts, these two arms, and the two arms bend away from each other in a limp Y shape at one end of the molecule. So the molecule has the property of being Y-shaped, and the Y-shaped end of the molecule has the property not being coiled in the alpha helix manner. And now we can ask, oh wait, are we attributing contradictory properties to this molecule? Being coiled in the alpha helix manner predicates a property of the whole molecule. But the molecule has that property just in virtue of the fact that it has these arms which are coiled in the alpha helix manner. The whole molecule borrows that property from its constituent subunits. But this is also true. CEP, qua Y-shaped, is not coiled in the alpha helix manner. That's because the entire molecule has a Y shape. So here we have the reduplicative strategy used to give consistent claims about this molecule. And now we can see how the reduplicative strategy is meant to resolve the puzzle about the apparently contradictory properties of the incarnate Christ. The apparently contradictory properties of the incarnate Christ are compatible because they are borrowed from the parts that are his two natures. But now an objection can arise, and that's because we can think, well, this sort of solution to the apparent incoherence of the doctrine of the Incarnation isn't successful because it fails to attribute the properties that seem inconsistent to the whole Christ. It just attributes the properties that seem inconsistent to the parts that are Christ's two different natures. If we return to the case of the molecule, then it seems that when we attribute to the molecule CEP the property being coiled, we are attributing to it the property having a coiled part. And when we attribute to it the property not being coiled, we are attributing to it the property having a part that is not coiled. There's no incoherence here, but that's because these are not incompatible properties. Not being coiled in one part and being coiled in another part, these are not incompatible properties. On this way of analyzing qualocutions, the properties which really are incompatible, being coiled and not being coiled, are not being attributed to the molecule. They're just being attributed to its parts. In the case of Christ, however, the apparently contradictory properties have to be attributed to one and the same thing. That is, they have to be attributed to the composite that is the incarnate Christ. Omniscience is predicated of Christ, the person, and so is being limited in knowledge. But think about the molecule again. A thing which has a coiled part really is itself coiled in some respect or other. And similarly, in virtue of having an end that's Y-shaped, the whole molecule is really not coiled in that respect or to that degree. So the apparently incompatible properties being coiled and not being coiled are truly attributes of the whole molecule. They're not just attributes of different parts of the molecule. In just the same way, if you have a wound bleeding in your leg, it really is true that you are bleeding, even if other parts of your body are not bleeding. We don't have to maintain that you are not bleeding, because it is, in fact, only your leg that is bleeding. And so think about the molecule again. A thing which has a coiled part really is itself coiled in some respect or to some degree. Similarly, in virtue of having an end that is Y-shaped, the whole molecule itself is really not coiled in that respect or to that degree. So the incompatible properties being coiled and not being coiled are truly attributes of the whole molecule. They're not just attributes of different parts of the molecule. And in just the same way, if you have a wound bleeding in your leg, it really is true that you are bleeding, even if other parts of your body aren't bleeding. We don't have to maintain that you are not bleeding because, in fact, it's just your leg that is bleeding. And now we can see how the reduplicative strategy handles the objection with regard to the incarnate Christ too. Some of the properties attributed to Christ are properties borrowed from his constituent natures. Christ is limited in power and not limited in power, but he borrows limited in power from his human nature, and he gets unlimited in power from his divine nature. Christ has the property of being limited in power just in virtue of having a constituent, human nature, which has the property of being limited in power in its own right. He has the property of not being limited in power just in virtue of having a different constituent, divine nature, which has that property in its own right. Because the incompatible properties attributed to the incarnate Christ are borrowed properties, Christ does not have them in the same respect. And so it's no more incoherent to attribute both human and divine properties to Christ than it is to attribute being coiled and not being coiled to the molecule sep. Because each of the incompatible properties is had in its own right by a different constituent of the whole, and because these incompatible properties attach to the whole only derivatively, in consequence of the fact that the whole has these constituents, then there is no incoherence in attributing both otherwise incompatible properties to the one whole. So on the Chalcedonian formula for the incarnate Christ, Christ is one person with two natures. One nature is fully human, and the other nature is fully divine. For this reason, Christ has two minds and two wills, and he can operate in either one of them. or he can operate in his human nature, but make use of some of the power of the divine nature, as I said earlier, when he works miracles. Christ cannot die in his divine nature, but he is God, and God is in his assumed nature, in his assumed human nature, can certainly die. So it is true to say that on the cross, God suffers and God dies. But when Christ dies on the cross, he does not die in his divine nature, because his divine nature cannot die. He dies only in his human nature. And so the Chalcedonian formula for the incarnate Christ is complicated, but it is logically consistent, and it is theologically powerful. And with that, I am done.